I'm Molly Bernard, and many, many years ago I started a small private school in South Bend, which became known as Stanley Clark School. Stanley Clark School came into being at a critical point, not only in my life, but in a certain sense in the life of the nation. In the beginning, it was the Mary Read Cleland School, named for my grandmother, who was not only an outstanding first-grade teacher in her native Scotland at the turn of the 20th century, but a social reformer and activist in London, Ontario, Canada, during World War I. It is strange to face this group of people, and I was talking at the time to a group of parents late on in the history of the school, this group of people, some of whom I know, but more I don't, and realize that my school, as I like to think of it, sprang from another age, another set of needs quite foreign to most of you. It was born in the post-World War II era, at the end of a decade very unlike any this group of parents can, for the most part, even imagine. I don't remember it very clearly myself, partially because it was a long time ago, and partially because the 1950s were traumatic years for my family. We had lost 3 children. First, a beautiful baby boy who was drowned in a pond in my parents' garden. Then our first daughter at age 7, and 3 years later, our only other son, age 9. Both of a strange blood problem, doctors linked to X-rays routinely performed at their premature births. Babies kept coming after these, all healthy, all little girls. 3 of them during my years in the school. Eventually, we had 7 daughters, all of them graduates of Stanley Clark School. The name of the school was changed by the board in 1965 to encourage donations from local citizens. It's given the name of a local notable individual. So why did we take on this project in the first place? A non-denominational private elementary school in a community where none had existed within anyone's memory. Partly, I suppose, because our surviving children were the focus of our lives, and we wanted for them things that the culture of the times and the community in which we were living could not give. The parochial schools, which as Catholics we would have been expected to choose, were unbelievably crowded. 60 youngsters with 1 nun in the first grade of the new St. Anthony's School. We lived in Madison Public School District, which was fairly well regarded, and we sent our children there. Mary Louise, whose birthday was in March, started kindergarten at mid-year, a few weeks before turning 5. A year later, in first grade, she took to reading like a duck to water. We plied her with all the children's classics I had loved back in the early 30s, and she'd sit curled up on a corner of the sofa, plowing through one book after the other. We didn't own a TV in those days. The bedtime story read by Mother or Daddy was a high point in the day for both Mary Louise and Paul. Peggy was a little young for the books we chose, but usually we took a quick dip into a nursery tale on her behalf. Paul was slower than Mary Louise at reading on his own. He was in first grade when his older sister died, but in second grade he discovered Squanto and the Pilgrims and became committed to books from there on. The fall of '56, we set out on a lengthy motor trip to visit relatives in Canada, then drove across New York State to the big city, where friends of mine lived in and operated a fashionable Catholic elementary school on East 89th Street. This was St. David's School, where in the mid-'60s, John Kennedy started his education after his father, the president, had been shot. His mother took him out of St. David's after a year because the school wanted him to repeat kindergarten. I was captivated by our visit to St. David's. I had never seen such a school. I immediately began to think, why couldn't we have a school like this in South Bend? The classes were small, the teaching so personal, the curriculum so rich. Even the kindergartners were learning French. The reading texts in first grade were an English series to which my friend David Hume, the headmaster, introduced me. They didn't remotely resemble the American Scott Forsman staple, See Dick, See Jane, See Sally, See Spot Run. Old Lob and the barnyard creatures in the English Ginn's reader had personality and adventures. Ginn's basic reading method was phonetic, which had been abandoned in most American schools back in the mid-'30s. Some of the more backward parochial schools, like St. Adalbert's on the west side of South Bend, continued to use the phonetic method with outstanding results, despite a largely immigrant student body. American primary education in the mid to late '50s was at a low ebb, geared to the lowest common denominator. Most parents accepted that, and those who didn't enriched their children's lives with literature and extracurricular activities at home, thereby creating a situation in which school itself was often seen as boring. Few mothers, at least in my circle, had jobs of their own at the time. Shortly thereafter, Russia launched Sputnik, the first effort at space exploration. The suspicion began to arise in the United States that among the nations of the world, we might not be the leader in all intellectual and scientific endeavors. Did American education leave something to be desired? At night we watched the skies and occasionally saw Sputnik passing overhead. It gave us an eerie feeling. In 1958, there was a change in the admissions policy at the South Bend schools. No longer would there be a February admission to kindergarten or first grade for youngsters whose birthdays fell between September 1st and March. Our bright little Anne, who was 5, December 15th, 1957, could not enter kindergarten until the fall of '58. Although she was already beginning to read on her own. If only we had a private school like St. David's, my husband and I moaned. Little by little, I began to entertain the notion we could start one. I summoned the courage to call a sorority sister of mine, who was the supervisor of student teachers at St. Mary's College. I asked her if she knew of any trained teachers, housewives like myself, who might be interested in part-time teaching kindergarten and first grade in a private school. She gave me 2 names, I called them straightway Peggy Emery and Barbara Everly. They were as excited as I at the idea of teaching again and doing it on their own. They came over a night or two later, and we spent an exciting evening dreaming of the ideal primary school that we would launch. Amazingly, launch it we did. That was March. By September, we had purchased an old house for $8,000, remodeled it up to a point, hired friends to teach art and music. I attended a new summer school program at Notre Dame on methods of teaching French in the elementary school, ordered books and materials, including the Old Lob reading series that David Hume had recommended, cleared the procedural aspects of our operation with various government authorities, then advertised for and recruited 15 first graders, all but one underage for the public school, as well as 14 kindergartners. It was to be a school tailored to the needs of individual children, a school rich in a combination of cultures, a school adventurous in exploring new avenues of thought, a school in which parents like ourselves would have genuine input. One of the first of such parents was a professor at Notre Dame, Bob Weinstock, who introduced me to the newly founded Council for Basic Education. This was a parents group out of California, parents and educators alarmed at the discrepancy between American public education and that of Europe. I subscribed immediately to their monthly bulletin, which gave me a solid basis on which to sell the school. Bob Weinstock not only enrolled his own not quite 6-year-old son in our school, but offered a scholarship for another child. I think we multiplied the scholarship with thin air and split it about 5 ways. There were at least that many offspring of Notre Dame junior professors and graduate students to whom our $300 annual tuition fee seemed enormous. Bob had a colleague on sabbatical in Europe, due to return in February, who would most certainly want to enroll his underage first grader. This was Ernest Eliel of the Notre Dame Chemistry Department, who became a most vital support to our venture over the years and ultimately a Cleveland trustee. These two good Jewish families and their fellow religionists, Barney and Sue Leviton, came on board so enthusiastically and with such an abundance of ideas and talent that we set aside any notion we might have had to give the school our own particular religious direction. At the same time, we could not, in good conscience, exclude all spiritual